Okay, so are people showing up?
Yeah, we're just working on getting it.
Okay, that's fine. I'll let the IT guys work on this. Anyway, so yesterday, some of the things that we discussed are with regard to the invoice format. We should probably let Barbara know that, yeah. I don't know, how do I manage her? Barbara, you should turn your video off because we can all see you eating your lunch. Yeah, I think we have audio. Nobody's talking. Nobody's talking. Audio, though? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, yesterday we first talked about the invoice format, and then we talked about the treatment note and what was required for each of those. And we talked about the different CCBs and how each CCB had a different form, different requirements. And then, so we started looking at what is truly required on an invoice. And we went to, and jump in anytime. Yeah. And we went back to what is required in the unicorn. So full name, and it should match what's on the IFSP. But then somebody brought up that that's sometimes an issue if the name in Medicaid doesn't match in unicorn. But that's one of those issues that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, thank you. But it pretty much came out that we need to have full name because you can have David Martinez, a David Allen Martinez, a David John Martinez. And we had a situation where we had twins, where it was the exact same first name and exact same last name and exact same date of birth, just a different middle name. And so we have to have all three names on the invoice, just to make sure that we can truly differentiate. However, one of the ideas that was floated around yesterday was, instead of using that, if there might be something in the unicorn, like the client case number, that we can use instead of name. So we will be looking into that to see if that's a possibility, because then that would take that issue out of the mix. So date of birth is necessary, session date is necessary, service type, so OT, PT, speech, in addition to, was it an IFSP meeting, was it a session, was it a no-show, was it for a speech therapist, was it the parent coaching aspect of billing. So this is all billing to the CCB, but that needs to be clear. The number of units needs to be on the invoice, the provider name, and the rate. When we talked about different forms, we had Imagine represented, and we had North Metro represented yesterday. And the providers in the room really preferred North Metro's invoice format that I guess they just changed as of July. And so they said that it was just a lot easier to use, that it calculates automatically based on the rate that they pay that particular discipline. But then that brought up the issue of, you know, Imagine pays each of their providers something different. So we talked about how the rate might be changed in that kind of a format, so that it would still automatically calculate according to that provider's rate. So I am going to be taking that back to the MAC group, the Metro Area Coordinators group, to look more at the different invoice forms, to see if there's a way that we can maybe agree on one, or you know, have something that's more consistent. The other issue that came up is people who have electronic medical records, EMRs, that oftentimes they don't have the ability to pull this information, and the information has to be entered manually. You'll see over there the different kinds of EMRs that people are using. It was funny because many of them mentioned and said, but I wouldn't use that for EI. That's not good for EI. I wouldn't recommend that. So the one that kind of floated to the top is ProviderSoft, because that truly is designed for early intervention. And there are a couple companies that use that. And they said that that actually works pretty well. We had one provider yesterday who said he just downloads the information, the invoice from his EMR, and submits it to Imagine, and it basically has all of this information, and it's been going through just fine. And I think that goes back to Imagine hand enters everything, and so the format that they get the invoice in isn't quite as critical as it is for like North Metro. North Metro, they just upload the information. And the other issue that came up is North Metro's form works really good for them because it aligns with their accounting system that they use to pay you all. And so it may not work with DDRC or Rocky Mountain or Imagine. But, you know, I think we just kind of need to work through those issues and see how can we make things more uniform to make it easier for providers who have to submit invoices to multiple CCBs. So before I move on to the treatment notes, I want to get your feedback from your experience. We had one provider who really loves DP's invoice format because they pre-populate. But then she said it was also an issue because it was like 6 pages long, and it doesn't include originally the new people that she picked up that month. And so she said it can kind of be a little bit cumbersome. But it's your opportunity to say, what do you like? What don't you like? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to have to repeat things for the people on Zoom. The comment in the room is that DP doesn't require that providers send their notes, but they have to keep them in case they're audited. Mickey? And it's the same for DDRC as well. And it is much quicker to not have to submit the notes as well. Beth?
Correct. No, we don't require it at all. We only require that the notes be sent. Some of our experience in past audits is when we did have missing notes, we were not able to locate them from providers and needed to pay back funds.
Right. So Beth said that at Rocky Mountain, they don't require an invoice. They just require the notes. Because past audits have shown that sometimes when they go back to get the notes from the provider, they're not available and they've had to pay back funds. So there's lots of different layers to all of this, always, but it's important to know. Yeah, come over here so that the Zoom folks will hear you.
So North Metro's invoice basically is an invoice that it has the name of the child, of course, in a different order from everybody else. So that might be a piece to work on. But within one invoice, they have a drop-down list for you to select the majority of those required things. So for the month, for example, you will have a drop down to list the month, and then you just have one separate line next to it to list all the dates of service for that one child. You would also have a drop down to list the service type or the type of session that you had as well. So your direct IFSP services, for example, could be on the same invoice as your IFSP meetings, and you just select a different thing in the drop down for that child. You put in, or it automatically calculates your number of units per your date of service, I believe, and then it does the adding for you. So it's very little having to go back and forth between two different invoices like we sometimes have with other CCBs, and pretty automated where it all gets captured via drop downs on one invoice. They've also done some troubleshooting so that this is can basically be used and seen on Mac and PC, which has been a challenge historically, I think, for some of us with some invoices. So I think that the drop downs and things really being kind of auto-filled or calculated or populated for providers was one of the reasons that they liked that invoice so much. So does that give you guys enough background to continue knowing what that combo was?
Do you have to send in backup notes too, or is it just
Actually, they do request backup notes, but to my knowledge, it's a softer requirement. They want the notes, they keep them for the history, but I don't know for sure that they are tied to you getting reimbursement. Does anybody else know the answer to that? Okay.
Okay. So North Metro does not require providers to send notes, but they do. Providers oftentimes will send them to the service coordinator. For the notes, I believe the notes are for every visit. Yeah. I mean, you should be creating notes for every visit. It just comes down to whether or not you have to send them to the CCB or just keep them on file. So, show of hands. Okay, Mickey has a question first.
Like that. So it's kind of an evolving process, I think, for CCBs too, regarding what information they need captured so that they can accurately reflect it on the uniform side to accurately pay providers.
Okay.
So I think it's
Okay, so Mickey is pointing out that there's additional information in the unicorn, for instance, a Medicaid denial, in order to determine if the provider should be paid. And then, so that needs to somehow be captured, either on the invoice or with the supporting documentation. Somehow that needs to be captured, that there was a denial. Did you say? Okay, so DDRC is updating their invoice and they're adding drop downs. So. What do you mean? Okay, so the comment in the room is that it's really nice if you can just put in a date of service, comma, another date of service, comma, and just kind of list the different dates of dates of service.
no.
For invoices, yeah, not for notes.
There's never any guarantee that it's the same number.
And yeah. So Mickey is pointing out that if there are different units for different dates of service, it can be challenging. But then the other answer to that is if it's a different date, if it's a different number of units, you put it on a different line. So it may be the same child, just to indicate like an IFSP meeting that went for 2 hours as opposed to a session that was 4 units back here. Okay, so in the North Metro format, which we'll be looking at, you have the date of service and then the units for that date. Oh, for the child across the month, so all of the units for the whole month. Okay. And that, yeah, that automatically calculates into what you get paid. The other comment about the DP invoice format is that the provider who is talking about how cumbersome it is having all the different pages is that it can be difficult to know exactly how much you're getting paid, because it's not really clear how much you're getting paid. And this is where, we get different viewpoints from different providers. It was anyway, the comment in the room is that DP does have a total at the end of their spreadsheet. Back. Okay.
On your invoice, you're already done with the service coordinator.
Okay. Okay, so one of the comments in the room with regard to DP pre-populating the names of the kids is that DP leaves it up to the service coordinator to close out the case. And when the case is closed out, then that name comes off of the pre-populated list. But if the service coordinator isn't keeping up with the paperwork, then you may have kids on your list that you're no longer seeing. Katie Price says she likes DP's invoice, just not the processing fee involved. Yeah. Yeah. So could everybody hear what Amy was saying? No. Okay, so Amy was just saying the issue with DP pre-populating the list is that it's good in theory, it's not always good in practice, and sometimes new kids don't always make it onto the invoice, even though providers have started seeing the kids. And then everybody in the room pretty much said that they really don't like the processing fee. So they're very much in agreement with you, Katie. Right. Uh-huh. Okay. So another individual in the room was saying, okay, so having to enter patients every month would take quite a bit of time. So I think it depends on how many new kids you have coming and going, depending on how cumbersome that is. Did you have? Yeah. Right.
Because clearly we have an accounting system that allows them to calculate an invoice. Other CPGs don't have systems that allow them to calculate. So I just want to acknowledge that for everyone.
And Mickey's pointing out that, you know, this is where it gets to be CCB specific with regard to the interface between the invoice and the CCB's accounting system and how well they work together, and you know, if they can pull from the invoice or if they have to manually enter things into that. So the question is about the processing fee that DP is charging. In the state plan, there is a section that says that CCBs can charge providers a fee if they follow certain steps. And that is, they have to have a policy that's been approved by their board of directors, that the policy has to include specifics about exactly what they are charging for, how much they're charging, and some method for providers to argue or, you know, kind of disagree with paying that fee. And they have to have some process for going through and negotiating what's going to happen with that fee. And so that's the process that they have to follow according to the state plan in order to be able to charge for fees. They should not be charging for fees for putting, they should not be charging for fees if they don't give you an option to bill private insurance and Medicaid on your own and say you have to use them to bill that. Oh, and by the way, we're going to charge you a fee. They can't do that.
So is there a way for providers to look up the classification?
It's in the state plan. You can ask for the policy.
Okay.
And if they can't provide you with a policy, then they're not following the state plan and they're out of compliance. But you can look in the state plan. I think it's under the broker section of the state plan. So. Yeah, if they say you have to let us bill insurance and Medicaid, if they leave it as an option that we can do the billing for you and you choose that option, then they can charge you a fee. But if they require you to use them to bill, then they can't charge a fee because they are requiring you to do that. And then that gets into issues around labor laws and whether or not you're an independent contractor, and so that gets into other messy areas. Okay, so can they charge for billing EI funded only patients? I can bring that question back to Christy. My initial thought is no, because we are paying them their administrative costs to do billing through the unicorn for state and Part C funded kids and trust funded kids. But I can take it back to Christy and get a more definitive answer. Okay. Let me just write down a note here. Okay. So with regard to the EI invoicing, how many people in the room have their own EMR? Okay. And how many of those EMRs have all of this information? Do any of them? Or can they be modified? So it's full name, date of birth, session date, service type, number of units, provider name, and rate.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
It doesn't equal out that. The EMR is really for
Medical. Yeah.
medical reasons.
So,
Billing and
okay. So I think Brenda says that they have an EMR. Ours does not have a rate on it. And this was some of what we were hearing yesterday, is that the EMRs really don't have all of the information that's needed in EI. Yeah.
Or we just launched a new on the 8th of this month, and ours does. We don't have the rate entered in it because we're not doing our billing from that. We do all of our CCD billing as separate central invoice finance system, but ours does have the capability for the rate.
Okay, so Rocky Mountain does have the ability to have all of the information that we have on kind of the unicorn requirements. They just don't have the rate in right now. Darcy? Right. Yeah. Okay, so Darcy is pointing out that most EMR, EHRs, you can export the information and then translate the information because they usually have time, not necessarily units, but you can convert that into the number of units. Angela?
You have what we call fee schedule, not rate. And so you have a fee schedule. It doesn't matter if you're billing $1 or $1 million per unit. It's what people are reimbursing you that. Does that make sense? So we usually have like a flat fee schedule for a 92507 and a flat fee schedule for a 97532 or whatever stuff is doing more. But does that make sense? So we have fee schedules in the EMR because that's how we bill insurances and Medicaid. But what is reimbursed is different. So when you're asking for, like, what is DP reimbursed? What is DDRC reimbursed? You can't change that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Angela is saying in their EMR, they don't have what they're intending to get reimbursed. They have their fee schedules and what they're charging. And so then it's up to the CCB to actually pay the rate that they reimburse. So, yes. Uh-huh. So what's being raised is whether or not to add service coordinator. To the invoice format, it came out yesterday that we were talking about adding service coordinator, and pretty much not adding the service coordinator to the invoice was fine because the service coordinator doesn't necessarily need to be tied to the invoicing. But many of the people there felt that it was really helpful to have the service coordinator tied to the treatment note, mostly so that the treatment note can go into the correct children's file. And yes, we recognize that that's not something that is in an EMR, and you have to separately put that on. But that's one of those things that is kind of up for discussion, whether or not that is a critical piece. Most of the CCBs felt like it was really a valuable piece of information. So those of you who are here from CCBs, what are your thoughts on having this service coordinator name?
My thoughts, my contract. Whatever in my contract. But I feel like it's less critical now because we have an electronic system. So I can just attach a note to a child, and whoever's the service coordinator at that point in time will see that based on looking at the child's record. Before we were entirely electronic, the service coordinator was very important because there was a manual process of handing pieces of paper to people.
Okay, so let me stop there for the people on the Zoom. So Rocky Mountain, now that they have an electronic system that they can more easily tie the notes to the child and it'll automatically go to the service coordinator, it's not as critical to have the service coordinator name on there because it's not such a manual process. Other CCBs, Mickey. Oh, okay, so for GDRC, it doesn't matter because they don't request treatment notes. Yeah, and it, no reason to have it on the invoice. Heidi, what about DP? Hi, DP doesn't need it. So that might be one of those things that might be able to go away, which would be helpful for those people who have been doing it manually. Yes. Right. Yeah. And the other comment in the room is that because of turnover of service coordinators, the information that you have of who the service coordinator is might not necessarily be accurate. And so you're not necessarily putting in accurate information if you're putting in the service coordinator name. So that might be something to look at. Okay, so the other piece that is needing to be added in to the EMR is the funding source. And you're just listing, is it private insurance or Medicaid? And again, for the CCB people, how critical is that to have the funding source on the invoice? I think it goes back to if the kiddo has Medicaid and you've gotten a denial and so you're billing the CCB needs to know that it's a Medicaid denial. But it's something definitely to think about and look at whether or not that's critical or if there's another way we can look at that information.
Mm-hmm. Billing and insurances and everything like that. There's more and more data points that have to be kind of reconciled between the two to know for certain that everybody's accessing what they are
should be. Yeah. Yep. Speak up.
I think I think from a provider or either billing company Medicaid on their own or going to. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, so let me start again. So I think that what that speaks to is the provider's need to know the funding source if that provider is either doing their own Medicaid and insurance billing or sending to a clearinghouse to do that, or using an EMR system, as providers, we need to know what the funding source is, so we know where to send each invoice or each note for each child. So that would be, I think, kind of a challenge in regards to us providers needing information in our systems that is not necessarily needed by the CCB or by Unicorn.
So yeah, the CC, and I think this is where it goes both ways. The providers need to know all of the different funding sources that this family has, that are tied to this child, but then the CCBs also need to know what funding source is being accessed, especially if the child has Medicaid secondary. Let's see, okay, so now we're talking about North Metro charging a fee for a mistake on the invoice. We can definitely talk about that as, you know, one of those challenges, maybe add it as a challenge. Yep.
Because if we get information on the IFSP, we go by that. Or none. Or none. Nothing information. But if we don't, that information has to happen when we go through the selection. And we can't just go back to, oh, you know what? You should.
Right. Okay.
You know, bemoan everything starts, every section. Okay, it's not. Now, that's but if we've been given information from the CCD and nothing has happened to our case, then that information has to be a final order. We have to check it.
Okay, so for the people on the Zoom, the comment in the room is about who is ultimately responsible for making sure that providers know what the funding source they should be accessing is for a given family. You know, is it the CCB's responsibility, you know, through the service coordinator? Is it the provider's responsibility to check Medicaid eligibility? And I think it's kind of both, because you know, a CCB can find out that the child has Medicaid, but then they find out a month later that the child also has private insurance. But the providers, if you know a child has Medicaid, you should still be checking eligibility every month to make sure that they haven't, every day, every time before you have a visit, to make sure that the child hasn't switched over to CHP+. And so, yeah, the private insurance is where it gets the most messy. And that's actually one of the challenges that was brought up yesterday, is that issue with private insurance. And one of the questions that came up is, Kaiser's not always trust.
So it would be nice to have the service coordinators go in and do front and back of insurance and that. In my opinion, if we are responsible for doing insurance.
Okay, so the comment is that the IFSPs need to be consistent from the front page to the back page in terms of what is the funding source. Is it private insurance? Is it Medicaid? Is it trust? And so the question on the chat is, where do we check eligibility? That's primarily for Medicaid, and you check through the Medicaid web portal where you do your billing. That's where you check eligibility. Yeah. Yeah, so Amy is pointing out that in addition to getting a complete IFSP, that providers should also be getting the health insurance authorization form, a copy of that, to show that, you know, yes, this child is on the trust, or no, they're not. Let's see. They should. Okay, so the comment in the room is that many providers, or some providers, aren't getting the health insurance authorization form, and sometimes the information isn't consistent on that form with the IFSP, and so it, you know, there's a documentation downfall here. Mickey?
The service coordinator won't know necessarily as the developers of an IFSP whether or not it's from the top. So that's part of what you're saying may be inconsistent on the IFSP because they won't know at that point.
So if we're doing the billing off the IFSP and we're sending providers into the home based upon the IFSP, when do we get the accurate information? Because it's not even being followed up on.
Well, that's what, I mean, we've been working with Cynthia to streamline notification of trust plans. So that trust notification is the trigger, right? If it's part of the trust or if it's not part of the trust. So I would say specific for DDRC, we are sending copies of the insurance cards for every new child that's assigned and the HIAS, how we receive that from the family. That's included in all of our assignment emails, which go to the providers and to the service support.
Okay, so let me summarize for the people on the Zoom. So Mickey pointed out that when an IFSP is originally written, the service coordinator might not know whether or not a child is on the trust, and that could account for some of the discrepancy between the initial funding source and what gets put on the services page. But DDRC is now sending out a copy of the insurance card as well as the health insurance authorization form when they assign a provider. So the provider is getting that. And we have a comment from Brenda. Okay, so when we as an agency have a child through EI that we are billing Medicaid or another funding source directly, those names are not on the invoice to DP. We only submit on the invoice services for children who receive funding through EI. And that works as long as that's okay with DP. Anyway, I think we just need to look at the different systems that each CCB has and how we can maybe try and streamline some of them, look at the different forms that everybody has and what's required, but then also looking at the paperwork challenges that, you know, providers need certain things and they're not always getting them. You know, the information, particularly as it pertains to billing.
So many of our families will transition between Medicaid and state plus. And so our concern is, do we essentially put the child on hold and not meet the plan of care or visits while we wait on alternate funding from the CCB? Or would you prefer that we continue seeing the child, hoping that we end up with
So the question is about kids who go from Medicaid to CHP plus. In that case, you bill Medicaid, you get the denial because the kid's not on Medicaid, and then you bill the CCB to get those services covered. But keep checking eligibility because the kiddo might go back on Medicaid. I mean, they are really good about talking about their, year-long eligibility, but there are still a lot of kids that doesn't happen. Yeah. Uh-huh. It is. So Beth?
I just wanted to make sure that everybody remembers that on the ISSP services page, there is a statement that says if the projected funding source is not available, the hierarchy will be followed retrospectively back to consent. So if the funding source that's selected on the IFSP, if the child loses Medicaid, we need to move to EI state funds. That's okay, but that is a new IFSP to dictate that.
Right. So Beth pointed out that on the funding section of the services page on the IFSP, it states that if the funding source isn't available, the funding hierarchy can be followed, meaning that if Medicaid isn't available, then it can roll down to state or Part C dollars without having to have a new IFSP. Angela?
The July to July contract date, because if we're talking about a kid that might be denying, thank you, July. So how does that affect? Because if we're getting denials, in July for a kid that we saw in May for private insurance, how is the state going to deal with that? I think that that's a challenge that needs to be addressed.
So the question is regarding the end of the fiscal year, and if providers get a denial in July for a kiddo that they billed insurance for in May, how does that work? Will they be able to get paid? This last year, we allowed the CCBs to go back and pay for those denials. Back to March, or maybe it was only to May. Right, and so the CCBs were able to go ahead and pay if you had a denial from an insurance company, and we're not able to. We hope so. And that depends on our Part C funding, our federal funding, because that's what rolls beyond the end of the fiscal year. And it has been a big it has been a big concern where providers have had to eat services that they've provided, but then they didn't get paid for by private insurance, and the CCB didn't have money to pay. So that has been an issue.
So my question is, how long do we wait?
That is one of the questions that was brought up yesterday. It's like, how long should a provider have to wait to get a denial from insurance before they can bill the CCB? And that's one that we're taking back to Christy, because, you're independent providers. You can't wait 3 months, 6 months to get paid or get a denial so that you can then go back and bill another funding source. So it's something that at the state level we need to figure out and provide guidance around. But it's definitely something that was brought up yesterday that we're taking back.
They have no idea why or any reasons.
Medicaid suspensions are required to be resolved within 30 days. Well, then that's a problem. Let me know if you have suspensions that are over 30 days, because that's actually in their state plan that suspensions have to be resolved within 30 days. I've seen something from their state plan about suspensions and the timeline for suspensions, but let me go back and check. Because again, you're right, Becky, that is an issue. PARS on the Medicaid web portal. Okay, send me an email about that. Okay, so the issue is, right, is PARS are not showing up on the web portal. Okay, funding and the lag in PAR approval. Okay, Brenda, how long is it taking to get a PAR approved? Yeah, it should only take 7 days, but that doesn't mean it is. Okay, I'm writing some notes here. So, okay, it's taking 10 plus days, depending on the issues, to get a PAR approved. Okay. So if you are having issues with PARs getting approved, with not seeing the PARs, send those to me and I can shoot them to my contacts over at Medicaid and see what the issues are and how maybe to try and resolve some of those. And that's part of my job, is to kind of run interference for you guys when you're having problems with other systems like Medicaid. I can't always fix it because it's Medicaid, but I can at least put it in there. Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So yeah, she's pointing out that you can look in EQ Suites and see if your PAR has been approved and get the number, the PAR number, but it's still not showing up in the web portal, which is what you're looking for, because that's what ties to the billing. On the PAR? Okay. Okay. So she's bringing up that the TL modifier is not showing up on the approved PAR. Okay, so there is a known issue with PAR letters not getting loaded into the system. They are coming over from EQ Suites. From what Medicaid is saying, you should be able to see whether or not it's been approved on the EQ Suite side, but just because you have a PAR number does not mean it's been approved. It needs to say approved on the EQ Suite side. And it'll say approval, apparently, but you still have to look through the EQ side, not on the web portal side. Just a minute. Okay, so getting back to the documentation, which is kind of where we started, we'll be taking all of the comments and the information back to the metro area coordinators and working with them to see if we can come up with something more consistent across all of the metro area providers. And then also, those of you who have EMRs or EHRs, if you can kind of let me know what information you can download that would work for an EI billing, so that you don't have to do too much handwritten stuff, then we can pull that information in as well to see how easy we can make it for you who do have systems, who have a lot of providers, to make sure that we kind of cover those bases. And then to the treatment notes, and again, there are some CCBs that don't even require them. They require you to do them and keep them, but you don't have to turn them in. But the information that's required on the treatment notes that we talked about yesterday was essentially the same as the invoice format, but it also included service coordinator name. And again, I think we talked about that might be a non-issue anymore. The funding source, time in, time out, and that goes to a lot of the EMRs, that the EMRs require time in, time out, as opposed to the number of units. CPT codes, and that is so that we can be more consistent so that a treatment note that is written for a kiddo that has private insurance looks pretty much like a treatment note that is written for a kiddo that has Medicaid, that has the trust, that has state or Part C funded, so that we have more equity across all of the treatment notes, and it really doesn't matter what the funding source is. And what do you do if you do not bill CPT codes? You don't have to have CPT codes if you're not billing them. Yes, I will definitely talk to the people at Medicaid. Because I know the developmental interventionists don't bill CPT codes, but if you are billing CPT codes, have them in there, and the therapist's signature has to be on there, and then of course the notes. And one of the things we started getting into yesterday was kind of that disconnect between what's required for notes for a more medical model versus EI, the EI model, and the disconnect between the go for it activities and writing things very family friendly and throughout daily routines, but how does that mesh with the more medical write-up of you're treating a disability and here's your treatment plan. And this is where we talked about the note examples that we have on the Padlet, and how I worked with a couple providers and created these templates that have kind of the medical piece, but then at the bottom of the note really speak to what's on the IFSP and family outcomes and kind of more the family-friendly strategies around everyday routines, activities, and places. And so that's something that we can look at as a larger group and kind of talk through, well, what are the pieces that are more medical in nature, and how does that relate to the pieces that are more tied to the IFSP, and what's really necessary on a note, because we went around and around about what was really necessary on a note and what is extra kind of superfluous information that may end up getting the note kicked out of private insurance if you submitted it. So it's just, there's so many, little nuances to trying to mesh these two systems that don't mesh well. But there are ways to get around it, and there are providers who have figured it out, how to write a note that kind of speaks to both issues. And then our examples, we tried to do that for both evaluations and treatment notes. So Joanna, the CPT codes are needed on the notes, just to clarify. If you're billing insurance and Medicaid, that's best practice to have the CPT notes, the CPT codes. And in most cases, you do need to have the ICD-10 code, the diagnosis code. Again, because this is what justifies your billing to Medicaid or private insurance. And so the other piece is it kind of covers your license, it covers yourself to make sure that you are justifying why you're in there seeing that child. So there are those pieces that need to be covered. So Amy's been taking lots and lots of notes. These are the notes from today, and then these are the notes from yesterday's. So some of the questions that came up yesterday are the SLP PARs. And in the January provider bulletin, Medicaid said that the PAR system will be open as of February 1st for SLPs to start going in and creating PARs for all of their current kids. And then the system won't start looking to see if the PARs are in place until April in terms of the billing. And so that's the latest information I've heard. The billing manual is still being updated, so it doesn't really talk about PARs yet. Hopefully it will soon, and provide more information and guidance around what's required. Hopefully the SLP PARs will allow you to use the IFSP like the OTPT PARs, but we'll see. We don't know yet. The other thing about the SLP PARs is OTs and PTs have the 48 free units prior to having to have a PAR in place in order to do the billing. SLPs aren't going to get that. You cannot provide services without a PAR. And that goes back to the legislation that was created last year that is why the PAR is being required for speech therapists. Question? So the question is, if a PAR has been submitted and it was not approved, then the provider has to tell the family that they need to stop seeing them until the PAR is approved. My understanding is it goes back to the original PAR submission date once the PAR is approved, but I can double check with that and see. Yes, SLPs will get an evaluation that they don't have to do a PAR. Yeah, so they'll get like 4 units, an evaluation visit that they can do without having to have a PAR. And if they use the IFSP, they won't. I mean, best. Okay. Would you send that to me, please? Because that's not supposed to be how it's working. You're not supposed to have to get doctor's prescription in order to get PAR. But again, I think best practice is to get that script, again, to cover your license. But it, I know it, right. Right, and this is where we need to know what exactly is going to be required to get that PAR in place so that they can actually bill, and whether or not they can submit the PAR even if you don't have all of the information, or if you just have the IFSP, and then use that as the date to go back to. But these are all still questions for Medicaid that I think will be figure it out, hopefully in the next month. I know. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. So the comment is about, that we don't really have the information we need for the speech PARs yet from Medicaid as to what documentation is going to be required. And I can take that back to Medicaid. They've been hearing from me on a regular basis about this issue. Yeah. So yeah, the comment is around CCBs, and the 28-day requirement. And there's been an issue with SLPs not getting copies of the IFSP in a timely fashion because, or it's being sent to the providers and when it's a company and not to the company who is submitting the PARs, because there's that whole issue of if you have a review, the IFSP has to get to the provider within a week because they have to submit a new PAR because they can't see the child until that PAR is in place. And so there are all of these pieces that kind of play in. Okay. And then there's the issue of, let's see, when a previous provider has a PAR and you don't know who the previous provider was, you'll not be able to get an approved PAR until the PAR gets changed, the change of provider form. And how can the CCBs help with processing of making sure we know if there was a previous provider and who it was? And I can take that back to the CCBs and the MAT group because that is an ongoing issue.
So going back to your comment about prescriptions, I think where it gets a little confusing is that we don't necessarily need a prescription to bill Medicaid, but if we are billing a primary insurance in order to get a denial to then bill Medicaid secondary, we may need a prescription to bill the primary insurance company. And that takes my mind back again to that 28-day timeline and muddies the waters a little bit more.
It definitely muddies the waters more. Okay, we cannot hear you. Amy, you just talked too soft. So Amy was talking about whether or not to get a prescription from the doctor, and it may not be needed for Medicaid, but it might be needed for private insurance. And it goes back to the whole 3 days and the challenges there. Obviously, these issues aren't going to be solved overnight. It's going to take a while of us working on them, but if we all pull together and try and come up with some solutions and start working on them one at a time, then we can start kind of knocking them out and making the system a little bit better. General question: how will we get the information when you followed up on the questions discussed today? So what I am going to be doing is writing up kind of a summary from yesterday's meeting and today's meeting and sending it out to everyone so that everyone gets the information, because the information from today is a little bit different than the information yesterday, which is expected because it's a different group of people. But I will send that out so everybody has the same information, answers to the questions as much as we know, and then kind of our next steps of what we at the state plan on doing, and how we are going to be working with the CCB metro area coordinators, as well as taking things back to Medicaid about the issues that are popping up there. What are the requirements of a note, whether medical model or not? We're actually going to be saving that for another discussion, because I think that really is a bigger conversation of really looking at the notes. If you want, you can take a look at the examples that we have on the billing Padlet, and you can get to that by going to the EI Colorado website, www.eicolorado.org. I'm going to type it in the chat. Just a minute. And then go to community-centered boards. And then under community-centered boards, it's under, I think it's technical assistance. And then under technical assistance, it's Padlets. And under Padlets, it says EI providers. I know, isn't that crazy? And then that's kind of the billing Padlet. Okay. There we go. Okay. So there's the information for everyone to go to access the billing Padlets. And you can see what we've put together, and then, you know, we can, I plan on having more of these meetings to really start looking at what does therapy look like in, you know, EI best practice, what does it look like, medical model, and really, are they different, or is it just the notes that have to look different? And everything I've heard from providers who've been in the EI have all said that truly is just the notes that need to be different and more specific about what medical issue is being addressed versus, you know, the IFSP outcomes, but that can also be on the note. And it's like, what does that look like? How is it incorporated? And how can we kind of do that fine dance between the two systems? So one of the other things that came up yesterday was Medicaid moving to electronic visit verification. And if you haven't heard about this yet, you need to go onto the Medicaid website and just type in EVV for electronic visit verification, because this is coming. This is coming down from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. It was supposed to actually start January of this year, but the feds pushed it back for a year. But Colorado kept kind of moving forward with their process, and they are starting some pilots in April to kind of work out the kinks. But basically what it is every home visit that you have, you're going to have to basically clock in and clock out using, yes, using an app. They have an app that, and this is just the ones that are billed through Medicaid. And this isn't just EI, this is all providers. So this is CNAs, this is home health care agencies, it's everybody, where you have to basically clock in and clock out using an app. Or if your EMR has something that'll kind of, you know, track it, some of those systems, and they're trying to figure out how those systems work with the system that they're putting in. And there's also like a call-in option where you can actually call in using a telephone landline or a cell phone. But some of the issues that have been raised are around, you know, poor internet, no cell service, and how that all works. And that's why they're trying to pilot. It won't go into effect officially until January of 2020. But yeah, I don't, they're talking about it. I have not seen the app, but if you go into the EVV on the Medicaid website, you can see what's been discussed. You can see what the stakeholder questions are, the frequently asked questions. But just kind of a heads up to all of you that it's coming. You know, those are, so the question is, what about if, you know, you see a child that you don't think has Medicaid, but then you go back and months down the road, it's found that this child did have Medicaid, but you didn't do the electronic visit verification. These are all things, that's why they're piloting it, because these are the kinds of things that need to be worked out. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. So. Mhm. Right, yeah.
So I would suggest that if, you know, you want to be aware of what's happening, that a good place is the website.
Right. So if you go to, okay, so Mickey was pointing out that they sent the invite to the EBV stakeholder meeting, which occurs monthly, to all of their providers. But if you go on to the EVV website, you can click on the monthly meetings. And they're open to anyone. So you can go in person, because they always have an in-person option, or they have it webinar with closed captioning every single month. And that's where you can kind of get updated on the latest information and ask questions. And they're really very responsive. When I've been asking questions, they respond really quickly, and you too. Last month, they were responding pretty quickly. They don't have the answers, but they respond really quickly. So the Padlet. So then yesterday, we also started getting into travel reimbursements and what the different CCBs are doing. And you can see on one of the post-its over there, North Metro, they have one form that, okay, that's the billing. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, we were talking about what the different CCBs, how they reimburse for travel, if they reimburse for travel. And I said that from the state perspective, our guidance has been that CCBs pay for mileage, and then if a provider is traveling for more than 60 minutes, that they pay $25 an hour for that provider. That's the guidance we've been given. We've been giving for the last year. We started this a year ago. But what we're finding and what we're hearing is that how CCBs are reimbursing, if they're reimbursing, really varies. They might do $10, they might renegotiate a price, a rate, if they want you to go farther. or to a more remote area. I think DP and North Metro both will pay their providers to go farther east. DDRC will pay to get providers up to Georgetown or Idaho Springs. And so that they're looking at it through their reimbursement rate. So how everybody is doing it is really different across the state. But that was an issue that came up, not as much in the metro area as it was in other parts of the state, but it definitely came up yesterday. And so we were talking about that yesterday and just gathering information. We really aren't making any changes because we don't require the CCBs to follow our guidance because they have contracts with you guys and it's up to them what they put in their contracts. But we just wanted to let you know. Mickey. Mm-hmm. So Mickey's question is, the 60 minutes that we recommended, is it 60 minutes one way or 60 minutes there and back? It's 60 minutes one way. But because what we found was there were some CCBs that were paying a provider their full therapy rate to drive for an hour and a half to do a therapy visit. And so the therapy visit would be $450. Yeah, it's like, that's good work if you can find it. And so that's why our direction is a provider should not be getting their therapy rate to drive. And so, you know, that's why we came up with the guidance that we have given. Mm-hmm.
But I've never been paid double, like $450. So that if you have to drive an hour, 2 hours and 10 minutes, then that's basically halving the rate. You get paid.
So the comment is that if you're driving for 2 hours, you're getting paid, you know, 20. It's you're not getting paid your therapy rate for those 2 hours that you're driving. And you're absolutely right. You're not, but you're also not doing therapy. And so that's one of those things that, because we have wide spaces where therapists drive long way, you know, there has to be some kind of a balance between the driving and, you know, paying outrageous amounts for a visit. So, and I don't think there's any one right answer. If there was, somebody nationally would have figured it out. But nationally, reimbursing for transportation is all over the board. There's nothing consistent. It should be another rate. Right. Well, and that's, or yeah, you can look at telehealth or
to really do a good job, telehealth can be done at some appointments, but not at every appointment. And it's just, it is private.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
I mean, it's challenging to work in the parameters.
It is.
Do you recommend a CCP based a travel stipend off of the location where the CCP is, or based off of where the provider is located out?
Okay, so a couple things. On in the Zoom room, you were asking for repeating the mileage guidance. And so it's paying for mileage, and if you travel for 60 minutes or more one way, to get paid $25 an hour. That's the guidance we've provided to the CCBs. The conversation in the room was around the challenges of traveling those extra miles, especially when it's a specialty provider like nutrition, which they're few and far between, so they do a lot of traveling, and whether or not, how that should be reimbursed. And again, there's no easy way. It was recommended to try telehealth, but telehealth doesn't work for every visit, especially when the nutritionist is needing to take weights and measurements. And then the question came up, should the mileage, or I guess mileage, be coming from the provider's house or home location or the CCB? We don't have clear guidance on that. I can take that back to Christy and our fiscal team and see kind of what guidance they would provide, because I don't know. And look at the tax guidelines. Yeah.
I think also the reality is, ideally,
Personally, it's an availability of the right idea.
I mean, ideally, it'd be nice if residents like some to the full people like
Yeah. So the conversation is, it really depends on where the providers are, what specialty the providers are, the availability. So there's a lot of pieces that play into that. Okay, I'm writing some more notes. And just kind of a heads up for all of you that now with the new tax laws, you can't deduct your mileage. Yeah, at all. Yeah, so no mileage. Yeah. The flat rate, yes.
I mean, the tax law is personal. And if one deduction is business, I think it's different. I think you can do mileage that way. It's personal.
Right, you're personal, but a lot of independent providers, it is, it's personal. So it is kind of a problem, but, it just, ask your accountant what you can and can't do, because things have really changed in what's allowed. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question is, for the people on the Zoom, if the IFSP doesn't count for a Medicaid PAR, what pieces need to be in place in order to submit a PAR? You will probably have to use the information from the IFSP, but do your own evaluation and get a prescription from the physician in order to get the PAR. But hopefully Medicaid will allow the IFSP to be used, because they're allowing that to be used for OT and PT. So we are hoping that they will allow that to be used. Mm-hmm. So the question is about the assessment for an evaluation tool for EI. I don't believe that Medicaid requires a particular, they just require that you use a tool that is age appropriate. But, you know, most IFSPs, if the child has a communication delay, they've used the TPBA, the DAISY, the Battelle, one of the big, standardized tools for doing assessment. So you should already have that information and shouldn't have to redo all of that. Yes. But again, we don't really have guidance from Medicaid yet on what they're going to allow or not. So it'll be good when we get that, which Friday, read your provider bulletin because they will come out and hopefully there will be more information there. Well, yeah, yes, it'll come out. Who knows what's going to be in it? Let's see. Medicaid allows for the IFSP to take the place of a physician prescription. Medicaid does not require you to use a standardized assessment for an evaluation. And I think, Brenda has her own home health care agency. And you guys get a script though, right? Yeah. So
anywhere where you can go back to the Colorado Bar and say, the IFSP takes place.
Yeah, it does.
Where?
It's in the billing manual. I'll send it to you. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I can find that in the billing manual and I can attach it to the notes that I send out about these meetings. So I can definitely send that out, but it's in the billing manual. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And so, if you don't choose the script from the doctor, then you're going to have to go through and find the code that you want to use.
So the comment in the room relates to the ICD-10 code, and she prefers getting that from the physician, which, I mean, that's fine. That's because then it's the physician's code and you've got that script and you're good. But if there isn't an ICD-10 code on the IFSP, and so if you're using the IFSP, then you have to figure out what ICD-10 code fits what it is you're treating. And that goes back to what is it you're treating, Darcy? Okay, so Darcy pointed out that it's a little dicey to just be out there putting your own diagnosis code on, but if you have a diagnosis code that has been signed off on by the physician, then that gives it the legitimacy that helps protect your license. Becky. Okay, so Becky is pointing out that for PTs, they have to have a diagnosis ICD-10 code, a medical ICD-10 code, and a therapeutic ICD-10 code. that the PT is the one who determines the therapeutic ICD-10 code. And so we will wait and see what they require for speech. And there was somebody over here. Yes. Okay, so the comment in the room is about billing private insurance. And from the state level, we are only requiring providers to bill private insurance if the child has Medicaid secondary, and you have to get a denial first from the private insurance before you can bill Medicaid. We are not requiring providers to bill private insurance. That's not coming from us. It's the only time that a provider has to bill private insurance is if the child has Medicaid secondary.
Sounds like everybody's dealing with it in the room. I would love to know. I'm just curious. So we're not, so Beth said that the state stance is that we are only supposed to be billing primary insurance if there's a secondary Medicaid. Okay. But the CCBs are sending out IFSPs with primary insurance, and they're expecting us to bill Blue Cross Blue Shield or Cigna or United Healthcare. So if everybody's getting the same things, how are you guys dealing with it? I would love to know. Because you made a really good point.
Okay, so for the people on the Zoom, the question is about CCBs requiring providers to bill private insurance outside of those kids that have private insurance and Medicaid secondary. I was gonna go, do you want to address it or Beth? Which one? Okay, so Jody's gonna give some insight. Yes, the funding hierarchy says that private insurance comes before Medicaid. You are correct. However, only if the primary insurance and the kiddo has Medicaid secondary. And the reason for that is because we have heard so many challenges around billing private insurance that before we really start pushing that, we want to have a better handle on what are the issues. Is it cost effective to even try doing that for the providers? And what are some of the mechanisms that are in place to support billing private insurance? I understand. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
That's why we-
Right. Okay, so Jody has a very good point in that Rocky Mountain has chosen to follow the funding hierarchy to Fidelity, and I appreciate that. And even though we are not really pushing providers to bill private insurance, they are saying that if you take a child that has private insurance, you must attempt to bill that private insurance to follow the funding hierarchy to Fidelity. That's how they're prioritizing referrals.
Yeah, so if you can build the funding hierarchy and pick up this kid, you get the referral prior to a provider who cannot bill this child's insurance.
Right.
If there's no providers who can bill Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, then
Okay.
no PT can pick up the
Yeah.
referral.
Right. Okay, so just for the people on the Zoom, I'm going to try to summarize this. So Rocky Mountain has said that they are prioritizing their referrals to providers who can bill the insurance that the family has, whatever the commercial insurance is. And if they don't have anybody that can bill that insurance, then it goes, rolls down to the next funding source and broadens the pool of providers who can pick up that kid. And, Jody's right, because we did pull back money from CCBs when it came that we had to require you all to bill Medicaid. So Rocky Mountain doesn't want to take on that liability, and I get that. I really do. But I am just saying this is our stance at the moment, and, where Christy comes down on it, we've had this conversation many times, and this is where we are at the moment. But you're good to be cautious, because who knows when the JBC might say you have to start billing private insurance, and then that rolls downhill. And then there's a comment from Brenda. Concern comes when you're required to bill the commercial insurance as primary and you're not an in-network provider. The denial you get from the commercial insurance because you're out of network. It's my understanding that that is not a valid denial reason in order to turn around and bill Medicaid as secondary. That's not my understanding, but I can go back and I can check Medicaid. Because I actually had this very conversation with Gina Robinson at Medicaid, and she said that if you get a denial, you get a denial. And it doesn't matter. Yeah, Medicaid is supposed to cover it. But I will double check with Gina. Okay, so over here, and then. Right.
people have experienced this in this room, that Medicaid came back to providers and took that. So I can also see that on the provider's plate. So even some of the bigger organizations that are being represented here today, we've been screwed too. So I can see how insurance would come back later and be like, oh no, those kids were denied, we're so sorry, and now we're out of the fiscal year. Now we have nobody to bill. Like, this is, and we're out of timely. So I could see how this is a trickle effect for sure, but it definitely affects the providers in the home.
Right. Okay, so for the people on the Zoom, you know, the comments in the room have been around kind of that trickle-down effect. If we take back money from the CCBs and the CCBs take back money from the providers, or if the information on the IFSP about the funding source is incorrect and the provider doesn't double check that and bills the CCB, and then the CCB says, oh no, you should have been billing insurance, we're going to take those funds back from you. These are all process issues that we need to figure out, obviously. And yes, Brenda, I will get the issue about denials in writing from Gina, because she actually, I think it's in the general information manual, but I'll have to check with her. And I will get something out. I'm going to have a lot of things in these notes. And we are out of time, but just a heads up for all of you, this is just kind of like the beginning. My next step is to go back to the metro area coordinators and work with them to see what we can come up with to try and have something a little bit more uniform in terms of the invoice format and what's required of providers, especially providers who contract with more than one CCB. And then after that, the next step is to go back and check some of these things that I said I would check on and get the notes out to everyone. And then probably the next meeting I have with metro area providers will be focusing more on the treatment notes and the disconnect between EI and Medicaid and the medical model, and how to kind of start trying to bridge that gap as much as possible. One more question. That's a whole nother meeting, but yes, did you put that down, the referral process and streamlining the referral process as another topic of discussion? A bright idea, yes. Yes, we can definitely see what we can do as far as that goes. So anything that we can do to make the system work better for everybody, the CCBs, the providers, everybody. So I'm going to stop the recording, and the recording of this and yesterday's meetings will be posted.